The relationship between Canada and the United States has seen better days. Our steel and aluminum industries are right now being hit by trade tariffs slapped against them by President Donald Trump about 6 days ago. Now we're hearing about a testy phone call between the Prime Minister and the President in the days leading up to Trump's controversial decision. Trump also reportedly in that phone call made reference to the War of 1812 when he was speaking to Justin Trudeau, saying, quote, "Didn't you guys burn down the White House?" Of course, that was the British who did that because Canada was not yet a country at the time either. Let's bring in our Angle on America panelists to walk us through what we're talking about here. We've got in Washington both Republican strategist Corey Crowley and U.S. political analyst Steve Farnsworth standing by. Okay, Corey, I'm going to start with you. It wasn't us who burned down the White House. It was the British. Your take.
Well, thanks, first of all. Also, they sent a lot of help to help us rebuild the Capitol and the White House after they burned it, so I think they saw the error of their ways. Listen, the president is clearly bent on escalating this trade war. There's a problem, though, I think, Todd, with his rhetoric, which is using national security as the reason to do it gives him very little latitude to back off later on. If he said this was about access of U.S. goods to foreign markets, even though they're our allies, then there's some room for negotiation. But how do you take a step back if something he wins, say, is greater U.S. Car exports? Then how does he come back and say, well, now steel and aluminum aren't so big of a national security threat? That's where I think he's boxed himself into a difficult situation here and is going to have very, very tough conversations when he gets up to the G7.
It's interesting, Steve, too, because basically the strategy on the part of the Canadian government has been very simple. Charm the pants off Donald Trump. Anything you can do in order to win over the president. And it seems, at least at this point, that it hasn't really worked because we don't have a deal on NAFTA. Our steel and aluminum industry is getting hit. We're hearing in the Washington Post now that Canada could, in fact, be targeted by other tariffs as well. What's your read?
Well, I think that this is a bad situation that's likely to get worse. You're looking at an environment where Donald Trump really feels cornered, I think, by the Russia investigation. And so he's looking for places where he can make his mark and where the conversation is about something other than possible collusion between Russians and the White House. And so I tend to think that, Canadian U.S. relations are kind of a collateral damage here. I mean, it's very important, of course, to the trade relationship of the two countries. But I don't think that the Canadian government should be faulted in any way for trying to work with Donald Trump. It's just the reality of this situation that Donald Trump tends not to work well with others. And that situation is intensified, I think, because of other factors that Trump is facing right now, including the possibility that one of Trump's top aides may end up going to jail for allegations of witness tampering this week.
We were hearing from Larry Kudlow as well, Corey, who is Donald Trump's economic advisor today. He held a press conference at the White House in which he said, the Prime Minister of Canada will have a bilateral meeting with Donald Trump on the side of the G7 summit, and this will be an opportunity for the two men to talk one-on-one about trade. And we know they seem to, anyway, have a pretty warm relationship. Of course, what Donald Trump says to you when you're in front of him in a room is sometimes very different from what he says when you are no longer in the room.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And just look, Macron thought when he was here, the French president, that he made lots of great headway with Donald Trump, and then turn around and Donald Trump backs out of the Iran deal just the very next week, almost like he was just trying to snub him. I think that the difference here is where the Europeans are going after Trump seems to be a little better, I think, strategically. And that is that they're looking for help from Congress and from the U.S. Senate. So, for example, they've decided to slap tariffs on bourbon and whiskey. Why is that important? Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, is from Kentucky, the home of bourbon. And Bob Corker, the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, is from Tennessee, where whiskey's made. So I think you start getting allies by striking the heart of industries in specific states with tariffs, like the Europeans are doing, and you'll find that they might shut off the president's ability to negotiate anything else on trade or to slap on tariffs. Because don't forget, this is permission given by Congress to the president. It can be revoked at any time, and I think Donald Trump's walking a fine line of getting that revoked.
Steve, Corey was talking about Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who just landed here in Canada moments ago ahead of this big G7 summit. And it really seems as if we might be looking at a scenario at this summit of sort of the U.S. versus everybody else, kind of like the G6 plus one, where you have these European allies and Canada, even Japan to a certain extent, getting sideswiped by some of the Trump administration's trade policies. And then you've got Donald Trump. And he really does seem to think that the global economic system is tilted against your country. What is the environment going to be like at that G7 summit?
Well, it's not going to be pleasant for Donald Trump, and I think Donald Trump will accent the extent to which these other countries kind of gang up on him. I think that Donald Trump is a connoisseur of victimization politics. When you think about Donald Trump, who won a presidential election, he's still going after Hillary Clinton. When you think about the increasing number of people who've been charged, if not convicted, who are in the Trump orbit with respect to collusion of Russia, you call it fake news. And so when the G6 plus one, which I think is probably a fair scenario for what we're likely to see in the coming days, takes shape, then Donald Trump will come back to Washington and say, see, everyone's ganged up against us. This may not be good for the economy. It's probably not good for the global environment, but it may help Donald Trump in his difficult political fortunes at the moment. Once again, I think that the real issue here with trade is not trade per se, but rather Donald Trump needing a win, and he needs to change the subject in the face of what is an increasingly difficult environment with respect to the Mueller investigation.
Yeah, how do you think this G7 summit's going to play out, Corey? Donald Trump has said, listen, I'm trying to defend U.S. interests, and I gather that's what all the leaders of these other countries should be doing for their countries.
Yeah, well, and I agree with Stephen to this extent, which is that if everybody else gangs up on Donald Trump, it's going to play right into his hand coming back here. It's the same mistake liberals here in the United States haven't figured out yet. The more and more you bash him, the more and more negative press coverage you give him 24 hours a day, the more he's able to go out and say, look, everyone's against me. I'm fighting for you. I'm the only one fighting for you. All these other people are biased. And he's going to say the same thing when he comes back from the G7. It's going to be, look, France, Canada, they're all looking out for number one themselves. It's time we look out for number one, too, and stop trying to be the nice guy going around and handing out favors around the country or around the world, which is how Donald Trump sees the world. We may all disagree, but unfortunately, right now, he's the guy whose opinion matters, and I don't see him going up to the G7 to give any ground at all.
It's interesting as well, Steve, because, there are some commentators who say, that the real situation here involves trade with China, and that many countries, Canada included, and many European countries as well, would say that China has unfair trading practices. So wouldn't you want to have a concerted approach in which you get all of your allies together and you make sure China understands what's going on? In this case, it seems to be sort of you're starting a skirmish with the Canadians and the Mexicans and the Europeans and the Chinese and the Japanese and the South Koreans, and on it goes.
Well, I think that's a real risk of Donald Trump's foreign policy, because over and over again, you see with respect to the Chinese and the Russians in particular, Donald Trump has alienated potential allies who would stand up for either a better trade arrangement with the Chinese or promotion of democratic values with respect to Russia and dissidents in the orbit of Russia. And so you're looking at over and over again a decision by Donald Trump to coddle dictators, particularly on trade policies, and really put the most heavy burdens on those countries that are actually traditionally part of the international economic framework that the United States and those countries have benefited from. You are hearing talk in Washington today, in fact, of a whole level of higher tariffs against the Canadians in particular if the Prime Minister of Canada moves forward with another round of attacks on the United States and its goods. And so you see a spiraling upward, because if there's one thing we can count on with Donald Trump is when friends are involved, he tends not to back down.
Gentlemen, great to have the two of you with us, and we're sorry about the White House.
Thanks, Todd.
It's not your fault, Todd. Thank you.